You are nothing but a bastard, Carey!
How dare you speak such treasonous lies? I will see you hang for this!
There are scandals that history refuses to forget, and then there are those so dangerous, so intimate, so entangled with the bloodline of a dynasty, that they are buried alive beneath marble, reputation, and silence. The name Henry VIII brings to mind 6 wives, 2 executed queens, and a kingdom reshaped by one man's desperate need for a son. But behind the shadow of that obsession lies a quieter sin, whispered in corridors, scribbled in the margins of letters, and repeated at court with nervous glances over the shoulder. What if 2 of Henry's illegitimate children were not just bastards, but bastards born from his sister-in-law? What if the niece and nephew of Anne Boleyn were not only Boleyns, but Tudor's Mary Boleyn, elder sister to Anne, had once been the English mistress to a French king, referred to mockingly by foreign tongues as the English mare. She returned to England in the year 1519, with experience, allure, and the gaze of men twice her rank. Shortly after, she was placed as maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, but her position at court was no accident. It placed her within the king's view. And Henry, ever the predator cloaked in velvet, did not look away. They said she was beautiful, with hair like burnished copper and eyes that caught fire under candlelight. But more than that, she was willing, or perhaps unable to refuse. In a court where fathers and husbands measured ambition in proximity to the king's bed, Mary Boleyn became both pawn and prize. Her marriage to William Carey in the year 1520 was celebrated in public with all the flourish of a noble union. But the truth was more sinister. The king attended the wedding himself. Less than a year later, he was Mary's lover, or had been all along. And that is where the record grows quiet, purposefully quiet. The relationship between Henry and Mary was never publicly acknowledged, but the rewards began to flow. William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and distant cousin to the king, was suddenly granted lands, titles, and income far beyond his station. In the years between 1522 and 1526, he was handed manors, boroughs, and noble appointments with no military victories, no diplomatic achievements, and no clear merit. But the timing was precise, too precise to ignore. Mary Boleyn gave birth to 2 children, a daughter, Catherine, and later a son, Henry Carey. The exact dates of their births remain in debate, but one fact remains chillingly aligned. On the 20th of February, 1526, William Carey received a grant of the borough of Buckingham, in tail mail, that is, with inheritance specifically tied to a male heir. Just 12 days later, on the 4th of March, Mary gave birth to a son, a boy named Henry, and though the king made no announcement, and the court made no accusations, the whispers began. Why would Henry VIII, a man obsessed with male succession, bestow lands tied to a male bloodline, mere days before the birth of a boy to his former mistress? Why would the child bear the name Henry, the king's own? And why would William Carey, who had no standing to demand such gifts, receive them at all? Some said Mary's marriage had been a smokescreen, a celibate convenience arranged to preserve appearances while the king continued his affair. Others believed that the Boleyn family, ever ambitious, had offered Mary knowingly to secure royal favor and fortune. And still others looked at the children, the red hair, the Tudor eyes, the uncanny resemblance to their supposed uncle, and saw a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. But the most damning moment came not from a courtier, or a spy, or even the king himself, but from a child, around the year 1535. A boy named Henry Carey, no older than 9 or 10, was pointed to by a royal official who said, "This is our lord the king's son," by the queen's sister. Not est. Not a scandalous insult. A statement, spoken as fact. And the queen's sister, by that time, was long out of favor, because Anne Boleyn, newly queen and newly jealous, had cast Mary aside. When Mary remarried beneath her station in the year 1534, she was banished from court entirely. But was it because she had defied social order, or because she had once borne the king's children, had Anne, even at the height of her influence, feared that Mary's children were a threat to her own legacy? If the rumors were true and Henry Carey and Catherine Carey were indeed the blood of the king, then the implications ripple far beyond scandal. It would mean that Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was raised and cared for by a woman who was not just a cousin or loyal courtier, but her half-sister. It would mean that the Tudor line, already a tangle of betrayal and ambition, was even more haunted than the histories admit. But most damning of all, it would mean the king, in his desire for a male heir, nearly married his own daughter. For there were murmurs that Henry considered marrying Henry Fitzroy, his known illegitimate son, to marry the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. But what if he had looked to Henry Carey instead? What if the tangled threads of lust and legitimacy had wound the king into a knot? Even he could not escape, yet he never claimed them, never provided dowries, never arranged royal marriages for either child. He did not educate them at court. He left them, but quietly favored them from afar. They rose. Nonetheless, Catherine became chief lady of the bedchamber to Elizabeth I. Henry became Baron Hunsdon and protector of the Queen's household. They were always near power, always trusted, always in the room, but never crowned. And in that gap between what was whispered and what was written lies the true scandal. The niece, the nephew, and the king, who may have fathered them both. She walked the line between wife and offering, between mother and ghost, between woman and warning. Mary Boleyn was not born to be remembered, but to be useful. Her name would not echo through rebellions or rest in the mouths of poets, but she was the first Boleyn to catch the king's eye, and the first to lose her name to a lie too heavy for truth, the first to bleed for ambition not her own. She was, in every way that mattered, the perfect mistress, beautiful, compliant, and, most importantly, married to a man who would not ask questions. William Carey may have been her husband in name and contract, but the child she bore belonged to another. And he knew it. He had to know it. He looked into the eyes of a boy with red gold hair and saw the face of a man who ruled him. And still, he said nothing. Mary married William Carey on the 4th day of February in the year 1524. With the king himself in attendance, that detail alone should have sounded louder. It was not custom for monarchs to attend the weddings of minor courtiers unless the bride carried a particular interest, and Mary did. The affair between her and Henry may have already begun, or it may have been arranged after the vows were exchanged. It hardly mattered. What did matter was that shortly after her marriage, the grants began to flow. Land, money, appointments, estates. Gifts that a man like William Carey, though connected by blood to the Beaufort line and a distant cousin to the king, could not possibly have earned on merit alone. And all of them came within the years when Mary began to swell with life, She did not conceive immediately. In fact, 5 years passed before her first child was born. That delay has often been cited by historians as suspicious, in an age when fertility was both expected and demanded. 5 years of silence in the cradle could suggest illness, incompatibility, or abstinence. There is no record of miscarriages, no record of infants buried in the cold ground, only silence. And then, suddenly, in the year 1524 or 5, a daughter arrived, Catherine. No royal announcement, no letters of celebration, but within months, William Carey was granted the borough of Buckingham in tail mail, a peculiar choice for a man whose only child at the time was a girl. 12 days after that royal grant, Mary gave birth to a son. His name was Henry. He would be known to history as Henry Carey. But to those who had eyes and memories, he was something else entirely. He was too perfect to copy. The Tudor nose, the reddish gold hair, the same sharp cheekbones that cast shadows even in childhood. He walked through the palace like a reflection the king did not acknowledge, but never sent away. And Mary, she said nothing. She had done her duty. Twice, the court whispered, as it always did. Ambassadors made note of a boy of promise, thought to be born from the king's loins, but never officially named. Rumors swelled and receded like tides. The boy was seen in noble company, given access to corridors others had to earn, and treated not quite like a common child, and not quite like a prince, something in between. But the king kept his silence. He had already acknowledged one bastard, Henry Fitzroy, born to Elizabeth Blount. He had showered Fitzroy in titles, even whispered the word succession in his presence. But with the Carey children, there was nothing. And perhaps that was more telling than any declaration, because Mary Boleyn was no longer a secret. She was the sister of Anne, and Anne was becoming dangerous. In the year 1526, as Mary's relationship with the king waned, Anne's power grew. She was sharp where Mary had been soft, calculating where her sister had been accommodating. And unlike Mary, Anne would not be satisfied with being mistress. She would be queen. But before that crown could touch her brow, she had to erase the past. Mary's past, Mary's children, Mary's silence. Because no queen could tolerate the knowledge that her own blood had been touched first, had been used first, had birthed children from the same man who now offered marriage. And so Mary was pushed aside not with violence, but with distance. She was no longer summoned to court. Her name appeared less and less in the lists of ladies attending the queen. She remarried in the year 1534. A union made for love or escape. No one knows, but the man she married was below her rank. A scandal. Anne, now queen, banished her sister from court entirely, not for impropriety, but for marrying without permission. That was the excuse. The truth is less clean. Anne had given the king a daughter, Elizabeth, but she had failed to give him a son. And every time Henry looked at Mary's boy, growing tall and confident, the question returned. Had Mary succeeded where Anne had not? Had the king already fathered the heir he so desperately desired, and cast him aside in fear of the scandal it would unleash? William Carey died in the year 1528. He had never spoken a word of doubt, never asked for confirmation, never demanded acknowledgement for the children his wife bore under his name. He left debt behind, and it was not the king who paid them, but Mary. She used her own resources, begged help from her family, and ensured her children remained at court. And they did. Catherine Carey would serve as a maid of honor. Henry Carey would rise to become Baron Hunsdon. Both would thrive under Elizabeth I, but always as shadows, never as heirs. The silence around their births is what condemns most loudly. If Henry had not fathered them, why not say so? Why not deny it? Why not distance himself? Instead, he remained quiet. And the court learned to read that quiet like a sentence etched in stone. The ambassador from Spain recorded that there was a child whom all supposed to be the king's. A courtier recounted being told by his superior that the young Master Carey is the king's son by the queen's sister. Even Catherine and Henry themselves seemed to grow up knowing what they were. They were children raised to speak softly, bow deeply, and never ask for more than they were given. Because what they were given was not enough to prove paternity, but far too much to be coincidence. And Mary, she faded from history. She did not write memoirs. She did not protest when Anne fell. She did not beg for restoration. She lived quietly, quietly, her legacy left behind, not in words, but in the shape of her children's faces, in the way the court bent around them without ever naming the reason. She was a mistress. She was a mother. She was the first Boleyn to give the king what he wanted, and the last to ask for nothing in return. He did not need to ask. He never did. When a king wants something, silence becomes permission, and resistance becomes treason. And Mary Boleyn, for all her charm and beauty, was not born to resist. She was born to obey, to bend without breaking, to accept the cold weight of royal attention as if it were a blessing instead of a sentence. The night she first lay with the king is lost to history, not because no one knew, but because no one dared record it. It passed without fanfare, without confession, without poetry. But its aftermath was loud in all the places where history lives in ledgers, in land deeds, in the quiet flow of gold from crown to courtier. Mary's womb had value. That was the unspoken truth beneath every silk dress, every courtly smile, every gloved hand held out to dance. And Henry VIII, king, husband, hunter of heirs, knew exactly what it was worth. He had already failed with his wife, Queen Catherine. Year after year of stillbirths and lost sons, he had fathered a healthy boy with his mistress Elizabeth Blount. And for that child, Henry Fitzroy, he had created a dukedom out of nothing. He had wrapped him in titles and dreams, publicly displayed him as proof that his blood was not the problem. But he had also buried Fitzroy before the boy could claim the throne. And so the king, driven by a hunger that no feast could satisfy, turned to Mary Boleyn with the same cold calculation. Could her womb give him another chance? He did not declare his intentions. He did not need to. The rewards began quietly. Even before the rumors took shape, William Carey, Mary's husband, was given the kind of honors that had nothing to do with merit. Between the years 1522 and 1526, he received grant after grant properties, lands, wardships, entire manors placed into his hands as if the king were returning borrowed favors. But William had done nothing. He had won no battles, penned no treaties, led no armies. What he had done, and what everyone knew he had done, was remain silent. And for that, the king paid handsomely. In June of the year 1524, William was granted the borough of Buckingham. That same year, Mary was nearing the end of her first pregnancy. A daughter, Catherine, was born unannounced, undocumented, but unmistakably privileged. And then, in February of the year 1526, Another grant arrived. This one came 12 days before the birth of a son, a boy named Henry, a boy whose name was the king's, a boy whose existence, though never publicly claimed, was never quite denied. The coincidence was too sharp, too cruel. A grant to William Carey in tail mail, meant to secure inheritance through male lineage, delivered just days before a boy was born to a woman the king had already possessed. A gift that looked like a bribe. A signature that looked like a confession. But still, no one said anything, because saying something meant accusing a king of fathering a bastard with his wife's maid of honor. Saying something meant pulling a thread that unraveled not only Mary's honor, but the king's own claim to virtue. Saying something meant dragging the queen into the shadow of her sister's bed, and reminding her that while she bled in childbirth, her husband found solace in the arms of another Boleyn. And so they said nothing. But the court watched. They watched the boy grow tall and fair, with the same reddish gold hair and fierce Tudor stare. They watched the king cast glances, not filled with affection, but with a strange calculation, as though measuring what he could never acknowledge. They watched as Henry Carey was placed in positions of proximity, as Catherine was drawn close to the inner circles of nobility, as Mary's disgrace never quite arrived, despite her eventual exile from court. They watched and understood these were not ordinary children. But the most telling part was what the king did not do. He had acknowledged Henry Fitzroy, even considered legitimizing him. He had paraded him through court, married him off young, filled his future with hope. But with the Carey children, there were no titles granted in their youth, no grand ceremonies, no official patronage. Instead, there were gifts without names, favors without explanation, and a deliberate silence that screamed through the tapestries and corridors of Whitehall. It was almost as if Henry wanted the truth to remain hidden, but also wanted the world to suspect it. That was the game. He could not afford to claim Mary's children, not after setting his sights on Anne. He had begun his pursuit of the younger Boleyn sister not long after Mary's last child was born. The transition was swift, brutal, and without apology. Anne, sharper than Mary, refused to become just another mistress. She demanded more, and the king, blinded by desire and desperation, he was willing to give it to her, even if it meant divorcing his wife, defying the Pope, and splitting the church in half. But to give Anne the crown, he had to bury Mary's story, and the children, and so he gave, not openly, but strategically, estates and honors, minor positions, silent support, enough to elevate, never enough to prove. And through it all, Mary kept quiet. She raised her children with dignity, kept them close to the court, but never demanded recognition, whether out of fear, pride, or understanding. She played her part. She knew the night that had changed everything was not hers to speak of. The night no one dared mention. That night, somewhere between loyalty and ambition, between sisterhood and sacrifice, the king came to her chambers, whether it was before or after her marriage, whether it was her choice or her duty, whether it was love or something colder, no one can say. No letters survive. No witnesses testified, but the evidence lived in the shape of two children, in the unease of a court that saw too much, and in the rewards that followed her womb like shadows. And in that night, history folded itself into silence. Because when kings commit sins in darkness, the consequences are not erased. They are simply crowned. They moved through the court like reflections. No one dared acknowledge two children born into privilege, but not quite into name. Draped in silk, yet weighed down by silence. Catherine Carey and Henry Carey were raised among nobles, trained in manners, taught the language of power, dressed like the sons and daughters of wealth, but never once called what some believed they truly were. Not lady, not lord, not prince, not princess. Just Carey, a name that hid the truth, or tried to. The thing about resemblance is that it does not fade with time, it sharpens. The older they grew, the more dangerous their features became. There were whispers, muttered behind goblets and fans, that the girl Catherine had the same smile as the Queen's father, that the boy Henry's posture, his brow, his cold and unflinching eyes, were cut from the same mold as the king. And then there was the hair, that infamous Tudor red, not a coppery rust, not a chestnut auburn, but that fierce, unmistakable, fiery red that lit up in sunlight and glowed like flame in candlelight. The king's hair, the king's mark, the color that had run through generations of Plantagenets and Tudors, now flared brightly atop two heads that were not supposed to wear it. William Carey had dark hair. So did most of his kin. Mary Boleyn's coloring was more golden. And yet, somehow, Catherine and Henry emerged painted in the colors of a throne they would never claim. People noticed. They always noticed. But the brilliance of Tudor scandal was not in what was said, it was in what was never said. The court learned to nod politely, to look away when the boy walked too close to the king, when the girl sat beside a princess with too familiar a gaze. Everyone understood the rules. Truth was not a thing you spoke. It was a thing you hinted, a thing you carried in posture and silence. The king never looked directly at them for too long, but he never sent them away, either. That was the cruelty of it, the double edge of royal favor. The boy was allowed to thrive. The girl was allowed to serve. They were given the best tutors, the finest fabrics, the places of favor that no common child could dream of. But never once were they acknowledged for what so many believed they were. Never once were they called son or daughter. Never once were they protected by name. Henry Carey grew tall and cold. A boy who seemed always to be calculating, always aware of how precarious his place truly was. He learned early how to listen without answering, how to nod without agreeing, how to smile without giving himself away. He served, as expected, in Parliament, as an attendant, as a courtier, as a bodyguard. But in his eyes there was a distance, a hunger, the kind that belongs to someone who knows what was taken from them before they could ask for it. Catherine, meanwhile, was warmth forged in restraint. She became a maid of honor, then lady-in-waiting, then, in time, the chief of Queen Elizabeth's bedchamber. That in itself raised new whispers. If Catherine Carey had been Henry's daughter, then Elizabeth and Catherine were sisters, half-sisters, hidden behind titles. And yet Elizabeth, who trusted few, trusted Catherine with everything. Her letters, her health, her secrets, her sleep. No one ever questioned why. Because in the quiet, they knew, and the mirror kept reflecting. There were moments when Catherine would stand beside the Queen, both women wrapped in English silk, red hair piled atop regal brows, eyes scanning ambassadors and traitors alike. And there were moments terrifying, silent moments, when the resemblance was too much to ignore. It was like watching the same fire burn in two bodies, one crowned, one cloaked, and always, behind them, the legacy of Mary Boleyn smoldered like a candle that refused to die. The portraits tell part of the story, though they have been altered, restored, faded with time. But even now, when you place the images side by side, Henry VIII, Henry Carey, Catherine Carey, Elizabeth I, something tightens in the chest. Not a recognition, but a confirmation, a line of flame drawn through blood and silence and ambition, connecting a king to the children he never claimed, and from them to the queen who would become legend. And still, the questions went unanswered. Why did the king give so much and yet say nothing? Why did the court tolerate 2 children born of scandal and yet never dare remove them? Why did the queen exile Mary Boleyn and yet keep her children close? Why did Elizabeth, whose heart was fortress and mind was blade, choose to trust only Catherine? The answers are not in documents. They are not in proclamations or grants or family trees. They are in the things Henry could not control: the color of hair, the curve of a jaw, the instinctive, chilling recognition that comes when a man sees himself reflected in a face he cannot name. That was the true danger of the Carey children. They were mirrors, living, breathing reminders of a night that history buried but never erased. And the king, who had rewritten scripture to crown a different sister, who had shattered a church to birth a new queen, who had sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold when her usefulness waned, could not bring himself to destroy the children who bore his image. He could ignore them. He could deny them, but he could not undo them. They existed, and they looked like him. So the gifts kept coming, not as acknowledgments, as apologies, land, titles, quiet support, royal glances that lasted half a second too long, an absence of punishment, a careful path paved through court that allowed them to thrive without ever threatening the throne. They were not heirs, but they were close, always close. And Mary, she watched from the shadows. She said nothing. She had played her part. She had given the king what he needed, and then been discarded when her sister rose to take her place. She had survived, and through her children, she had left behind a legacy that the Tudors could neither erase nor claim. 2 red-haired children, 2 silent questions, 2 living mirrors, and a king who, for all his power, could never look away. She had come to court with fire in her voice and steel in her spine. And when she left it, her head fell into a basket. Anne Boleyn, the second queen of Henry VIII, the woman for whom he had broken his marriage, his church, and nearly his country, had risen further than any woman before her, and fallen faster than any queen in English memory. But before she lost her crown, before she lost her life, she did something quieter, something far less remembered, but no less revealing. She banished her own sister, Mary, the sister who had once been mistress to the king, the sister who had once borne children that looked like Tudors, the sister who walked through court with silence on her lips and secrets behind her eyes. Mary, who had done what Anne feared most, given the king a son. Or so they whispered. Anne's rise to power was not paved in innocence. She had watched the way the king's gaze had moved from woman to woman, watched her sister offered and then discarded, watched the quiet devastation that came from being a mistress no longer needed. And Anne, clever, proud, determined not to be another forgotten body, in a royal bed, refused to play the same game. She would not be touched and thrown away. She would be queen. She would have the crown. She would give him a son and hold England in her hands. But Anne's ambition had a shadow, and that shadow was her sister. Mary Boleyn had known the king first, had tasted what it meant to be wanted and rewarded, then cast aside without ceremony. And worse, Mary had given birth to children who carried in their bones the features of the man Anne now intended to marry. Catherine Carey, Henry Carey, 2 children born during Mary's marriage to William Carey. Yes, but children who bore no resemblance to their father, children whose names never left the king's lips, yet who were treated better than most. Anne knew. She must have known. She would have seen it in the boy's face, in the girl's smile. She would have seen it in the way courtiers stared too long, or looked away too quickly. She would have seen it in the gifts, the land, the subtle positioning of 2 children who had no titles but every opportunity, and she would have felt it, that sharp, cold sting beneath her ribs, the feeling of being second even when crowned. So when Mary married again without permission, without strategy, without care, Anne struck. It was the year 1534. Mary Boleyn had been a widow since William Carey's death in 1528. For 6 years, she had remained unmarried, living quietly, raising her children, staying close enough to court to be remembered, but never close enough to be dangerous. And then she chose for herself, not a nobleman, not a politician, not a man who could benefit the Boleyn name, but a soldier, a minor one, William Stafford, a man with no great fortune, no title, no alliance, love, perhaps, or freedom, or rebellion. Whatever her reasons, the marriage was a scandal, not to the court, who had seen worse, but to Anne, because queens do not share crowns, not even with sisters. The punishment was swift. Mary was banished from court, stripped of her status, her presence erased from the queen's circle as if she had never belonged. No farewell, no allowance, no defense. She vanished into obscurity, taking her new husband, her silence, and her 2 red-haired children with her. Anne, now queen in full, had secured her place. The threat was gone. The sister was silenced. And the king, he said nothing. But the silence did not erase the past. The court still remembered. They remembered that Mary had been first, that her children bore the face of their king, that Anne, in her obsession to become mother to a male heir, had banished the only woman who may have already given the king one. It was a shadow that would not leave her, and when Anne failed to give Henry the son he demanded when Elizabeth was born, strong and brilliant and unwanted, Henry's love began to rot. The same love that had lifted her above queens now turned sour. And Anne, for all her wit and defiance, could not undo the laws of nature. Miscarriages followed. Rumors spread. The queen had bewitched the king. The queen had betrayed him. The queen had mocked him behind closed doors. But some remembered something else. They remembered Mary. They remembered that Mary had been loved, if only briefly. That Mary had given Henry something that looked too much like a son. That Mary had been quiet, obedient, soft, and when compared to Anne, sharp-tongued, proud, unwilling to bow, the contrast became dangerous. And then the scaffolding was built. It was the year 1536. Anne had been queen for only 3 years. She was arrested, tried, and sentenced within days. Adultery, incest, treason, lies woven so tightly, they no longer needed to be believed. They only needed to be acted upon. The king washed his hands. The courtiers watched. And Anne Boleyn, once untouchable, once radiant, once crowned, was walked to her death with her eyes open. She said nothing of Mary. Not one word. She did not summon her. She did not write to her. She did not ask for her presence or forgiveness or protection. Perhaps she knew it was too late. Perhaps she knew that Mary would not come. Or perhaps, in her final days, Anne could not bear to look upon the woman who had first held the king's gaze, the woman whose children had haunted her from the moment she dared to dream of the throne. The axe fell. The queen was gone. And Mary, far from court, far from London, remained untouched. She never returned. She lived quietly. She watched her children rise. She watched her niece Elizabeth, of daughter of the sister who had banished her, become queen. And in that, there is a cruelty almost too perfect to name, because Anne Boleyn, so desperate to become mother to a ruling heir, had cast out her sister, only for her sister's daughter to raise the Queen of England. And Mary, she kept the secret. She took it with her, to the grave. The secret of a night no one dared name. The secret of two children whose eyes were mirrors. The secret of a queen who banished her own blood. And the kingdom that punished the wrong woman. He was only a boy when the words left his mouth. Not yet 12. Not yet carved by power, or hardened by court. Still half child, half shadow. But the moment he said it before witnesses, in a room where silence should have sufficed, everything changed. That is our Lord, the King's Son. Someone had said, pointing toward him. And the boy, Henry Carey, did not flinch. He stood, with his red gold hair and unblinking eyes, and let the words hang like incense. The implication was older than he was, but now it had a voice. A child had claimed the king, and the king did nothing. Not a denial. Not a correction. Not a punishment. Nothing. That, more than any grant or manner, or whispered resemblance, was what frightened the court, because silence is louder when truth is expected, and Henry's silence cold, heavy, and deliberate spoke in ways no proclamation could. He had ignored many things in his reign wives. Warnings, laws, oaths, but when a boy with his own face looked him in the eye and accepted the unspoken, Henry said nothing at all. Henry Carey had grown up inside the folds of royalty, but never within its embrace. He was not a prince, but he had the education of one. He was not a noble by birth, but titles followed him like shadows. From an early age, he was given the company of earls, the attentions of Tudors, the closeness of those who knew how to read political weather, and all of them knew this boy was different, not just because of the hair, or the name, or the eyes that looked too much like a certain sovereign's, but because of the weight he carried, a name he was never allowed to wear. He was clever, observant, polished, and he was quiet. He never repeated the words aloud. He did not boast. He did not corner servants and demand recognition. He did not threaten his peers with secrets they feared to speak. He simply was. He stood where he did not belong, and no one moved him. He walked in spaces that others earned through bloodlines and conquest, and no one pushed him out. He understood. Even as a boy, the power wears many faces, and the most dangerous one is the face no one is allowed to name. And still, the king watched. Henry VIII was aging by then, growing thicker in body, more volatile in temper, more fearful of shadows cast by his own ambition. His legs ached, his face flushed with drink and fury. He was a man whose glory had begun to rot, who had sent queens to their deaths and broken kingdoms in half, and yet somehow could not bring himself to look directly at a boy who might have been his own. Because what would claiming him mean? To name Henry Carey as his son would mean confessing to an affair with his wife's sister, a sin that could unravel the entire claim to his second marriage. It would mean tainting Elizabeth, the daughter he had barely acknowledged with the stench of incest. It would mean raising to nobility a child born in secrecy, one who now stood close enough to touch the throne, but not cleanly enough to hold it. And perhaps worst of all, it would mean that Mary Boleyn, cast off, banished, forgotten, had succeeded where Anne had failed. So he said nothing, but he gave everything else. In the years that followed, Henry Carey was placed where only trusted men stood. He became a member of Parliament. He was appointed to royal service. He was created Baron Hunsdon by Elizabeth when she ascended the throne. And she gave him lands, duties, honors, not just because he had proven himself, but because he was hers, whether half-brother or cousin or loyal blood. It didn't matter. He had guarded her in childhood. Now he would guard her crown. But even before Elizabeth, the Grants had come, quietly, predictably. The same pattern that had followed his father or his supposed father in the early years of favoritism now followed him: manners, positions, command, trust, and always that shadow behind him, the possibility that he was not simply noble, but royal. The court said little, the record said less, but the boy had spoken, and the king had remained still. That silence became his inheritance. Henry Carey did not push for more. He married well, but not ambitiously. He accepted what was given, bowed when required, and served until the end of his life without scandal. But there are letters private, fragmented, carefully worded, where glimpses of the truth still breathe. He referred to the Queen as kinswoman. He called her my sovereign. Yes, but also my comfort. And she called him my Hunsdon, a possessive that echoed with something more than politics. If Henry Carey had once called the king father, then it was Elizabeth who became his sister in every way but name. And what of the man who stood between them? Henry VIII died in the year 1547. Bloated, bitter, and consumed by fear, he had never publicly named his bastard children beyond Fitzroy, who had died young. He had left the throne to Edward, then to Mary, then, by omission, to Elizabeth. He left nothing to Catherine Carey, nothing to Henry Carey. Not gold, not titles, not recognition, but he had left them something more permanent. His face, his hair, his silence. And that silence would follow them all their lives. Even in portraits, those stiff, painted lies we use to pretend at immortality. Henry Carey looks like the king. He wears the same confidence, the same wide-set eyes, the same sharp, calculating brows. And still, generations of historians danced around it. A likeness, a chance, a rumor. But the boy knew. He had known from the moment the king looked at him and did not look away. He had known when no one punished him for speaking what others had buried. He had known when his path through court was paved with invisible hands. He had called the king father, once, quietly, and the king had said nothing. And in that silence, everything was confirmed. It is one thing to be born in silence, and quite another to live your life surrounded by those who know the truth, but will never say it aloud. Catherine Carey knew how to smile at power without needing to seize it, how to step forward just enough to be seen, but never so far as to invite questions. She had learned from her mother, Mary Boleyn, that visibility could be dangerous, that too much beauty, too much closeness, too much of the wrong kind of favor could pull a woman under flass. And so Catherine moved carefully, but not meekly. She did not rise in the way queens rise, with coronations and crowns and crowds, but she rose with constancy, with patience, with quiet devotion to the right people at the right time. And above all, she rose because of Elizabeth. To understand Catherine Carey is to understand her place in a web so tangled with secrets and ambition that even blood could not be trusted to mean what it said. If the rumors were true, and there are few who truly doubt them, then Catherine was not merely a cousin to Elizabeth I, but her half-sister, a daughter of the same king, and born of the king's mistress before her mother's sister became queen. If that was the truth, then Catherine lived with the knowledge that her mother, Mary, had borne 2 children for the man who would later kill Anne Boleyn and orphan Elizabeth at the age of 2. And if Catherine knew this, and surely she did, then every glance between her and the Queen, every whispered instruction, every moment of trust between them carried the unbearable weight of a truth too dangerous to name. Catherine's life at court began quietly. As most stories of women in Tudor England do, she was placed into service, trained in the etiquette of silence and subservience, and quickly proved herself as more than a decoration. She had her mother's poise, and her father's, perhaps the king's, watchful intelligence. When Elizabeth rose to power in the year 1558, one of her earliest and most trusted appointments was to make Catherine Carey her chief, Lady of the Bedchamber. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was an act of protection, of closeness, of memory. Elizabeth surrounded herself with few she trusted. And she trusted Catherine not because she was loyal, but because she was familiar in a way that even childhood friends could not be. There are letters, brief and formal, as most royal correspondence was, but they pulse with intimacy beneath the surface. Elizabeth refers to Catherine with possessive affection, elevates her husband Francis Knollys, places their children into favored positions, and offers grants that surpass courtesy. It was not the behavior of a queen toward a lady-in-waiting. It was the behavior of a woman keeping her only surviving sister close. And when Catherine died in the year 1569, the queen did not attend the funeral, but she locked herself away for days. No proclamations were made, no elaborate mourning displays. But everyone at court knew the queen had lost something she could not name, because to name it would have been to confess that her own blood had been denied a place it deserved. Catherine had been more than a servant. She had been a second mother. After Anne Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth had been cast into disgrace, declared illegitimate, left to wander the political wilderness of her father's indifference. Her mother's name had become synonymous with danger and betrayal, and the girl who would be queen was raised not as a princess, but as a threat to be watched. And it was Catherine who remained near, not in title, not always in open proximity, but in presence. When Elizabeth rose again, when she was finally declared legitimate, when she took the crown and ruled a kingdom that had buried her mother in shame, it was Catherine who stood beside her. And in that, there is a legacy far quieter than battle or blood. It is the legacy of being the one who stays. But Catherine's story does not end with service. It continues through her children, through the lines she established, through the blood she passed forward. Blood that may have been the king's. Her daughter Lettice Knollys would marry Robert Dudley, the Queen's favorite, creating a scandal that Elizabeth never forgave. Her son Henry Knollys served in Parliament. Her grandsons would become trusted nobles, and her descendants would live in the shadow of a queen who could never publicly acknowledge what Catherine had been. And through all of this, the memory of Mary Boleyn lingers not as a scandal, not as a ruined woman, but as a mother who may have given England not just one royal child, but 2. If Mary was the mistress who bore the king a daughter and a son, then she was the root of a secret dynasty that ran parallel to the one the Tudors recognized. She was the woman who, in being discarded, left behind something permanent. And though Anne Boleyn had been crowned, had been remembered with fire and beheading and legend, it was Mary's children who endured, who survived, who remained close to power, even when power refused to claim them. To imagine the last days between Catherine Carey and Elizabeth is to imagine a queen who had banished most of her family, who trusted almost no one, holding the hand of a woman who looked like her, who reminded her of youth, who reminded her of something lost before it could be spoken. When Catherine fell ill, the queen sent gifts, prayers, commands for comfort. When she died, the queen was silent, and silence, from a woman who had ruled by words and declarations, was more telling than any eulogy. They never said it aloud, that she had been her sister, that she had been born from the same man, that the Tudor line had begun with a sin, and that sin had borne daughters who ruled the throne not by right, but by sheer will. They never wrote it. They never confessed. But they knew, and in that knowledge lived a bond deeper than blood, a bond carved in absence, built in loss, sustained in every gesture that never reached the history books, but shaped a reign nonetheless. Catherine had raised a queen, and Mary, perhaps, had raised them both. Truth does not always survive through parchment or proclamation. Sometimes it lingers in the mouths of those who should not speak, in the memories of those who were never meant to remember, in the silence after confession and the breath before denial. And though the reign of Henry VIII was heavy with noise axes, canons, sermons, and screams, some truths were so quiet they could only survive as whispers. The rumor that Henry Carey was the son of the king was not carried by ambassadors or ministers or traders. It was carried by those on the margins, by men in robes, by men who feared both God and crown, by those who knew that in the eyes of a child, sometimes the face of a king reflects too clearly to be dismissed. The whisper had already spread within the court. Of course, for years, everyone who passed through the Boleyn family circle had seen the way young Henry Carey walked up, the way his hair caught fire in the sun, the way the king had given without naming, the way proximity and protection had followed the boy like a second shadow. But it was outside of court, far from the polished floors of Whitehall and the stone corridors of Hampton, where the truth began to take shape in places the crown could not cleanse, in churches, in monasteries, in cloisters where men bent over Latin texts and read between the lines. 10 years after the boy's birth, in the year 1536 or thereabouts, a vicar named John Hales made a remark that was never meant to last. He spoke of a young Master Carey and noted, with the sharpness that only the politically aware possess, that many had begun to suspect the boy's royal blood. His words were not public. They were not shouted from pulpits or etched into books, but they were repeated, and that repetition gave them power. Hales was not a radical, not a revolutionary. He was a cleric, an observer, a man too curious for his own safety. And when he gave voice to what others only thought, it lit a fire that would not go out. There were monks, too, those who whispered behind stone walls, who remembered the grants given to William Carey and the timing of Mary's children, who saw in the red hair of Henry Carey not just coincidence, but divine irony in an England increasingly divided by faith, where monasteries were being dissolved and priests forced to choose between loyalty to Rome or to a king who claimed to be God's voice. Even monks had begun to question which sins were personal and which were national. And for some of them, the idea that the king had fathered children with both Boleyn sisters won a mistress. A queen was not merely scandalous. It was prophetic. And still, the king said nothing. Henry had already destroyed Anne by then, had already taken Jane Seymour, had already seen sons and wives fail. But he had never confessed to the paternity of Henry Carey or Catherine Carey, and the absence of denial became its own kind of admission. A man like Henry, who would shout against heresy, who would send men to the stake for calling his marriage invalid, who would slaughter monks for refusing his supremacy. He did not remain silent unless the silence served him, and that silence allowed the whispers to grow. Reginald Pole, exiled cardinal, enemy of Henry, man of both faith and vengeance, took up the rumor in his own way. He never said plainly that the king had children by Mary Boleyn, but he hinted with venom that Anne's ambition had learned from somewhere close, that if Anne had seduced her sister's lover, it was not because she invented seduction, but because she had watched it happen. Pole suggested that Anne had seen what came from being Henry's mistress, and resolved not to repeat her sister's mistake, instead choosing to become queen and keep the crown for herself. He never needed to name the children. The implication was enough. And yet, even as these men spoke, even as whispers echoed through stone and sermon, the truth remained elusive, because no one would put pen to paper. No one would inscribe the paternity into a ledger or baptismal record. There were no official declarations, no heraldic grants stamped with the Tudor lion. Only silence. And from that silence, the whispers continued to feed. But what made them survive was not scandal alone. It was what came later. When Elizabeth became queen, she placed Catherine Carey in her bedchamber and elevated Henry Carey to Baron Hunsdon. She gave them lands, titles, protection, and for those who remembered the rumors, it was confirmation disguised as loyalty. Why? They asked. Would a queen so famously private, so dangerously cautious, and surround herself with two people, so often linked to her father, why would she call them kin? Trust them with her life. Allow them into the rooms where she slept, unless she knew, unless the whispers were not whispers at all, but memory. But Elizabeth, like her father, never confirmed. She ruled for decades with the same careful deflection and the same refusal to name what everyone already saw, and the Carey children, for all their favor, never claimed more than what they were given. They did not reach for thrones. They did not demand recognition. They walked beneath banners they could not raise themselves, bearing the weight of bloodlines that had no name. And the whisper lived on, through paintings, through letters, through family stories passed in drawing rooms and private chapels, where sons were told they descended from kings, and daughters named after queens who were never acknowledged as kin. The Carey name became a house of echoes, filled with faces that looked too much like the Tudors and held their tongues too tightly to be accidental. Even now, Centurilateur, the whisper has not died. It lives in genealogies that bend toward possibility. It lives in scholars who trace the curve of a cheek or the slant of an eye. It lives in archives where records go missing, where dates do not align, where baptisms are recorded with gaps wide enough to bury a name. It lives because no one ever proved it false, and because sometimes the absence of proof is the clearest proof of all. The vicar is long dead. The monk's candle has gone out, but the whisper remains, and it still speaks, even if the king never did. Close your eyes and return to a time when truth was dangerous, and silence was power. Imagine a candle burning low in a royal chamber, its light flickering across a face that carries 1,000 secrets, none of them spoken. The woman seated there is not just a queen, not just a ruler of empires, but a daughter, a sister, a child of a broken family, stitched together by ambition and denial. She is Elizabeth I, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor sovereign, and she may have ruled from a throne of gold. But its foundations were built on whispers, half-truths, and a family story so tangled that even she never dared look too closely. For if she had, she might have seen that her mother's sister had given birth to children who looked too much like the king, and that one of those children, Catherine Carey, had raised her like a sister would, because perhaps that is what she truly was. There was never a proclamation, never a charter, never a moment when Henry VIII stood before his court and said, "These are my children, born of Mary Boleyn, born of sin, born of necessity." But power does not always require documentation. It leaves traces in the shadows. In the way Catherine Carey was placed beside Elizabeth at every step of her life, in the way Henry Carey was rewarded, protected, elevated, in the way Elizabeth, once queen, kept them closer than cousins, yet called them nothing more, because if she had named them truthfully, if she had called Catherine sister and Henry brother, then she would have confessed what history still hesitates to admit, that the bloodline of England's greatest queen may have been tangled with bastardy, with scandal, with a lie so fragile that a single word could have cracked the Tudor legacy in two. But Elizabeth did not speak the word. She ruled in silence. And in that silence, she preserved the crown. The throne she inherited was not clean. It was heavy with the ghosts of those who had come before. Anne Boleyn, her mother, had died on the scaffold, accused of adultery and incest, abandoned by the king who had once promised to move heaven for her. Mary Boleyn, her aunt, had been banished for loving too humbly or for knowing too much. Henry VIII, her father, had taken wives and ended them, had named children and unnamed them, had rewritten religion to suit his desire for sons, only to die with only daughters and a sickly heir. And through it all, the Carey children had endured, not named, not celebrated, but always present, always trusted, always near. The question that haunts the story is not whether Henry Carey and Catherine Carey were the king's children. The question is why. If they were, no one ever did anything about it. Why no claims were made? Why no inheritance was demanded? Why the royal blood, if it ran through their veins, was never named aloud? But perhaps the answer is simpler than it seems. Because in Tudor England, legitimacy was not about birth. It was about usefulness. It was about silence. It was about how close one could get to power without threatening it. And so the Carey children survived by walking that razor's edge. They never claimed more than they were given. They accepted the favor, the elevation, the access, but never the title. They stood in the background of coronations, in the margins of portraits, in the footnotes of letters, but they stood. They endured. They passed their names down through generations, and their descendants would continue to move quietly through history, bearing the ghost of a crown they never touched. Elizabeth, for all her brilliance, for all her myth and legend, understood the cost of survival better than anyone. She had watched her mother fall to a sword. She had seen her own title stripped and restored. She had played the game of silence for so long that by the time she took the throne, it was the only language she trusted. And when she looked at Catherine Carey, she may have seen her sister. And when she looked at Henry Carey, she may have seen her brother. But she called them neither, because the truth was too fragile, and the kingdom too cruel. And yet, the silence did not erase the truth. It made it louder. It made it linger. It made it follow every portrait of the Queen, every sketch of the Careys, every record of grants and land and appointments that made no sense except through the lens of blood. It made historians lean closer, centuries later, and ask not what was said, but what was not. And what was not said was everything. Now the candles have long since gone out. The tombs are sealed. The throne belongs to other names. But in the stillness, in the spaces between words, the truth still breathes. The Queen was born of a marriage forged in scandal. Her most trusted servant may have been her sister. Her blood may have run beside the blood of bastards unclaimed. And her reign, though glorious, began in the shadow of a secret that no one dared confess. So when you look at Elizabeth, seated in her golden gown, staring through time with eyes that yield nothing, remember that behind her stands a woman who raised her, a boy who once called her father king, and a sister who had been forgotten before the story ever truly began. They never looked back. But we must, because some lies build empires, and some empires forget where they begin.